Okay, so I have with me Johnny from Acts Reformed Church, and we're talking today about the Perpetual Virginity of Mary and Hanegraaff's conversion to Eastern Orthodoxy. And so Johnny, you just shared with me a video this morning. I was watching this James White video where he gave a rebuttal to one of Hanegraaff's videos, actually. I found that really interesting. I think the Perpetual Virginity of Mary is a good topic because the exalting of females in society, it creates a political divide. It can increase problems because it doesn't respect proper biblical rules for men and women. It puts things out of proportion. When, for example, you know, uh, wives are supposed to be submissive to their husbands in marriage, and women are not supposed to be teaching over men in church, basically. So I don't know how you want to get started here. What was your reaction to all this?
Well, I mean, the doctrine of the Perpetual Virginity of Mary is, it's a hotly contested issue between Roman Catholics and Protestants. And of course, the Eastern Orthodox, because they're not as large and they're not as influential as the Roman Catholic Church, we don't really hear them speaking about it. I mean, I'm sure they're there, but when you compare the how many people are Eastern Orthodox versus how many people are Roman Catholic, the Roman Catholics are a lot louder and they got more people to promote these doctrines. But when you're talking about the Perpetual Virginity of Mary, you have this doctrine that develops pretty early on in church history. You have people talking about it as early as the 2nd and 3rd century. And it becomes so popular that, in the patristic era, pretty much it becomes like common knowledge. Mary was always a virgin. And then other doctrines start to develop more, such as the Immaculate Conception or the Sinlessness of Mary, the place of Mary in terms of praying to her and other saints, and some of the exaltations that are made of Mary. I don't know exactly how far Eastern Orthodoxy goes when it comes to that, because I don't know a lot about them. And Eastern Orthodoxy, to my knowledge, they have systematic theologies, but they don't really think in those terms. Their lives are more about the experience and the liturgy and the tradition and stuff like that. Whereas Roman Catholics have that tradition and that liturgy, which is very similar to Eastern Orthodoxy, but Roman Catholics, because they're Westerners, they're very much willing to lay out, this is why we believe, and these are the categories and stuff like that. And so they're much more Western, and we Protestants are very Western as well. So that's kind of background there. But when you're talking about the Perpetual Virginity of Mary, the Perpetual Virginity of Mary is simply a doctrine that it's not taught in the Bible. It's simply not there. But what you have is a devotion to Mary and a tradition that develops, that when you go into these verses of the Bible that talk about, how Joseph did not have relations with Mary until she gave birth to her firstborn son. And so the natural reading of those texts, and I'm not a Greek scholar or a biblical scholar, I'm just a Christian layman. I'm not even saying that I'm as smart as Hanegraaff, because I'm sure that I'm not. But when you're looking at these texts, and then you have verses about Mary, the mother of Jesus, and the brothers of Jesus, and the brothers being named, and I think it's in Matthew 13, and then you have mention of his sisters, plural, which means two or more. You have these kinds of things in the gospel accounts. And so for someone who believes in the Perpetual Virginity of Mary, they have to come up with explanations for them. So maybe because the word brother can also mean cousin, it can also mean kinsman, or they could have been children from Joseph from a previous marriage. And so, though hypothetically you could come up with these kinds of explanations, the fact remains, is that the normal way of expressing themselves? And as I told you in a previous conversation, that if I was Matthew and I was writing an account of the life of Jesus, and I wanted to, and I believed that Mary lived your entire life as a virgin, that Joseph never touched her, you would think that I'd probably be a little more careful in the way that I write these things, so that people wouldn't think, oh, wait a minute, Matthew just wrote that Jesus had brothers and sisters, and he actually names the brothers. Why wasn't Matthew more careful about saying, instead of saying brother, why didn't he say cousin, or why didn't he say relative? So you have these traditions that then have to be read back into the text. Now, the thing about Hank Hanegraaff that is so fascinating is because in my personal background, I was in high school in the 90s. Like, Hank Hanegraaff took over CRI in 1989 when Walter Martin passed away, the original Bible Answer Man. So when Hank took over, he was a Protestant theologian. He was there. I mean, he wasn't really like an academic or a scholar of the original languages or a church historian, but he had incredible memory. He sits there and reads the Bible for hours and hours, and he reads these other books and he memorizes these things. So he has an incredible memory. He's very, very brilliant. And the first theology book that I ever read, from cover to cover, footnotes at all, was Christianity in Crisis by Hank Hanegraaff. So I was really, really aided by his ministry, and I called his show many, many times, both in the 90s and in the early 2000s. And so he was a Protestant. And so when people would call in and ask, what about the Perpetual Virginity of Mary? I spoke with this Roman Catholic, and the Roman Catholic said, et cetera, et cetera. And Hank would give the standard Protestant questions. I actually called him on that once. I have the recording somewhere, but I'd have to dig through it. And he told me that the word adelphus, which is the word for brother, that it means brother, blood brother. He actually said that to me in a phone call. So Hank recently, since he has converted to Eastern Orthodox, he said that he wanted this. I think the video came out on Friday or something last week. I could be wrong about that. And so James White presented a response, which I would recommend people look at. If they look at Dividing Line Highlights, it's a YouTube channel. They can look at actually clips, and they have the response that James White, where he reviews what Hank Hanegraaff said. So the thing about Hank is that he had Protestant theologians and Protestant scholars. I remember he had Michael Horton, Kim Riddlebarger. He had James White several times in the Bible Answer, and he also had Eric Svensson. And Eric Svensson wrote a scholarly tome. It's a really big one. It's called Who is My Mother? And in the book, he interacts with basically every single argument that Roman Catholics have tried to use to defend the Marian dogmas: perpetual virginity, immaculate conception, and bodily assumption. And so he breaks these things down, but specifically on the perpetual virginity of Mary, he goes into Greek constructions of phrases, particularly the phrase "heosu." I am not a Greek scholar, so I'm leaving this to people like James White and Eric Svensson to defend. But the point is that when you're looking at the meaning of a word, you don't just grab a Strong's Concordance or a Vine's Expository Dictionary, look up a word like until and say, oh, look, until means this. Okay, well, let's look at all the usages of the word. Oh, well, there's examples where until doesn't mean that things change. And so the argument is that since until doesn't necessarily mean that things have to change, therefore when Joseph says, when Matthew tells us that Joseph did not lay with Mary until she gave birth to Jesus, that doesn't mean that anything changed after the fact, is basically the way the argument goes. And so Hank started giving a list of these things, which is very standard in Roman Catholic apologetics. They will actually point to verses in the Old Testament where the word until is used, but there's no change made. And part of that is that you have to understand how a word is used in a phrase. And so in Matthew 1:25, you have heos hu. And every example that you can find in the New Testament, heos hu means until, but not after. And so the usage, and he went through a tremendous amount of research when he produced this book. And Hank Hanegraaff as I remember this, he had Eric Svensson on the Bible Answer Man. Now, if I misremember, I apologize. But my memory is that he was on the Bible Answer Man, and he promoted the book "Who Is My Mother." And so Hank Hanegraaff, I remember him saying he read the whole book in one sitting. And so the book goes through all those arguments. And Hank, when he says the opposite, because he was endorsing Eric Svensson's book. Eric Svensson's book was being promoted by Christian Research Institute on the Bible Answer Man. And so now Hank is doing a reversal and repeating arguments that had all been basically the arguments that Eric Svensson was responding to on a very academic level. Like James White wrote a book called it was Mary, Another Redeemer. And he goes through some of this material, but not to the level that Eric Svensson does. And so, like, if you want like a simple introduction, on the Marian doctrines and the Protestant responses, James White's book is really good, and it's actually, I think it's really cheap on Kindle. I don't remember what the price was. But Eric Svensson's is a more scholarly tone. And so when I look at Hank Hanegraaff looking at these verses, and then just ignoring all of the scholarship, all of the arguments that Svensson and White and many, many other Christian theologians, and then it's almost like he learned the information, and once he became Eastern Orthodox, it's like he forgot. And I'm not saying that he doesn't know the information or that he hasn't come up with some sort of answer. Maybe he has. But wouldn't this be the opportunity on the Bible Answer Man to say, okay, look, here's a book by Eric Svensson where he gets into things like Heos who and all these different arguments that Roman Catholics are using, and Eastern Orthodox use at least some of those arguments. You'd think he'd want to respond to all of these standard arguments. Instead, he just kind of says, well, until doesn't necessarily mean that there's a change. And brothers and sisters, we have to believe that Mary was walking around with a group of men who were not her kids, who were all grown men. They're all walking around, and apparently the sisters are all walking around with her. And so someone knocks on a door and says, Jesus, your mother and your brothers are outside, but that really means cousins or stepbrothers or kinsmen or something like that. And I just say, just as a lay person, I think to myself, if I was Matthew and I was trying to say that Mary was a perpetual virgin, I would have been more careful with my words rather than write the text the way I did. And then there's another aspect of it, because Roman Catholics will point out that, and I have to use the Roman Catholics and Eastern Orthodox because they use many of the same arguments and they're dependent on many of the same traditions. Now, of course, among the early church fathers, the majority did believe in the Perpetual Virginity of Mary. That hands down, that was a tradition that came down. Tertullian didn't. And an argument can be made that Eric Svensson does that Ignatius of Antioch did not, because there's a quote that he says, there's a quote from Ignatius, I don't have that in front of me, where he makes a comment about, after, I don't remember the exact quote, but an argument can be made that Ignatius didn't, and I think he argues that Irenaeus didn't, but that's really debatable. But the point is that what does the Bible say? But the other aspect of this is when you're talking about this issue, you're also talking about whether or not it's a part of the gospel. Are we supposed to look at the text of the Bible, and even if we believe, let's say for the sake of argument that the perpetual virginity is true, it's clearly not taught in the Bible. There's no verse in the Bible that says Mary never did this. And Roman Catholics basically like to argue, well, there's no verse in the Bible that says Mary had a child or gave birth to a child. There's no verse in the Bible that says that Joseph actually consummated the marriage with Mary. But I mean, it was a married man, married woman. Do we really need someone to tell us what they did when they were behind closed doors? So it's a simple implication. It's the natural course of events in a marriage, right? But the question is it a part of the gospel? And so it's like there are things in the Bible. For example, in John 21, Jesus tells Peter that he would die with his arms extended, right? Well, according to the tradition, Peter was actually crucified upside down. Now, that's never been confirmed in terms of the New Testament that he was actually upside down. We know that from Gnostic texts, which may have been just repeating a tradition that had been known. And so I do believe that Peter was crucified upside down. But is it a part of the gospel to know that Peter was crucified upside down? Or what about the story that John the apostle was boiled in oil? I don't know if it's true, but let's say that it was. Does that make that a part of the gospel? The Bible, according to Josephus, he says that James was killed. He was one of the elders in Jerusalem. He was killed, I think, in the temple or by the temple. Is that a part of the gospel?
Right.
It's just so many things. Abraham was the father of many nations, and you could say that's a part of the gospel. But do you have to then assume, well, maybe Abraham also, you can start tying up all these other doctrines that are not found in the Bible, and you could just start doing all kinds of things and say, well, the Bible doesn't say this or the Bible doesn't say that. And what you're basically going by is a tradition. And in the Roman Catholic Church, I don't know what Eastern Orthodoxy says about this. They put the anathema. In other words, it's a part of the gospel that Mary is always a virgin, and if you don't believe it, then you're excommunicated.
That's
So,
interesting. Yeah, that's a lot to reply to, man. Thank you. What it really comes down to is, like we were talking about the other time we were on the phone, heresy versus aberration. And as James White said in his video, he's having to abandon a sound hermeneutic. I mean, Mr. Hanegraaff. He's having to abandon a sound hermeneutic in order to say this stuff and appeal to something else above the scriptures, abandon sola scriptura, etc. And so now how are you going to be consistent in defending the Bible to Muslims and stuff if you don't have a consistent hermeneutic, etc.? You're appealing to traditions of the church fathers. I was looking at the website of Orthodox Church of America. And I think they appeal to Jerome. Do I have that right?
Among Eastern Orthodoxy, they like the Eastern Fathers, but some don't like Augustine. Others do. There are some Eastern Orthodox that really love Augustine, even though Augustine taught things that Eastern Orthodoxy doesn't teach. So it really depends on which Eastern Orthodox person you're talking to.
And so I wonder about Mr. Hanegraaff's conversion, like how much of it is due to him being a second-generation immigrant. I noticed in his biography he's a second-generation immigrant or a 1.5 generation immigrant. And so his family's assimilating to America, and he happens to stumble upon this Eastern Orthodox Church in North Carolina or whatever that is. And that's part of his cultural assimilation or an attempt to like keep stability, with the people around him or to, it's stability and power basically. It reminds me of like this historical figure, the Duke of Northumberland, also known as John Dudley from England, the guy that tried to make Lady Jane Grey the queen. And the minute that they wanted to kill, or they wanted to start executing them, he changed back to Catholic again, just because of those who were in power were Catholic again. So he switches his religion depending on whoever's in power, basically. I know that's not a perfect example, but it's like, do we have someone here who just switches their religion based upon whatever seems more powerful to do? I mean, I don't know. It seems he just liked the traditions and some of the artwork of the church or something. And also maybe you want to touch upon this. I know also in Eastern Orthodoxy.
I don't mean to cut you off, but Hank has written and spoken about how he converted. So the information is there. I don't know if you want me to touch on some of the information I know.
Yeah, say it. Definitely say it.
Okay, well, Hank, as far as his background goes, I remember he said he used to be a skeptic. And then when he was confronted with the evidence for Christianity, he became a Christian. And so and one of the beautiful things about Hank is that Hank always brings out a bunch of acronyms to help you memorize evidences for Christianity or the Bible. Like MAPS is an evidence for the Bible, manuscript evidence, archaeological evidence, prophetic evidence, and the science of statistical probability. Or issue like the resurrection, he has the acronym FEAT, FEAT, fatal torment, empty tomb appearances, and transformation of the disciples. So he has this really helpful way to do that. Now, in his upbringing, what I understand is that his father was, I think he was a Presbyterian, like he was Paedo, and he was a Calvinist. Hank, he's not a Calvinist, and wasn't as the Bible Answer Man. Neither was Walter Martin. And so Walter Martin, at some point, put him in position. There are audio recordings. I know that there's a controversy over who's the legitimate successor of Hank Hanegraaff, but according to, I think it was Walter Martin Jude 3, they put up actual clips of Walter Martin calling Hank the executive vice president of CRI, and he called him his friend. And so there was a relationship there. I don't know how long they were friends. I just know that they were friends, and that he was put in a position at CRI when Walter Martin died. Hank Hanegraaff took over. Now, Hank Hanegraaff was not a Calvinist. He was very ecumenical, but he was very much a Protestant. That's why when he had a Roman Catholic and a Protestant there, he would bring on like James White. He had 2 shows with Tim Staples. Each one, I think, was like 3 episodes long, like 3 hours long. Then he had another one with Jimmy Akin. So you have these things that happen. So this is his Protestant aspect. But he was very ecumenical in calling the Roman Catholic Church a true church with some false doctrine. And the same thing with Eastern Orthodoxy. And Walter Martin was a lot that way. He was actually very, very ecumenical, more ecumenical than you or myself. But Hank Hanegraaff started noticing a lot of controversies. And one of the arguments that is the most persuasive, I don't find it very persuasive myself, but a lot of people that have converted from Protestantism over to Eastern Orthodoxy or Roman Catholicism has been the differences of opinion that exist among Protestants and the different denominations. And so you'll find churches that are splitting about this and splitting about that and arguing about this and that. And so Eastern Orthodoxy and Roman Catholicism posit themselves as the solution. We have the church that was established by Jesus Christ. We have all these traditions that we can trace, at least they claim that they can trace all of their traditions back to the apostles. And of course, that can be challenged on a historical level. And so Hank, apparently, there was a controversy that came up, and some leader or some group was getting away with certain things, and Christians weren't doing anything about it. And at some point, his wife started attending an Eastern Orthodox church, or wanted to attend an Eastern Orthodox church. Hank started going there, and he started really, I guess, acclimating to that atmosphere of the liturgy and all of these things. And so he just kept going there and going there until eventually they did the christening, and those pictures of him being christened showed up on the internet. And a lot of people got upset because Hank Hanegraaff had always been a Protestant Bible answer man. In fact, I don't think personally that Walter Martin would approve of the current direction of CRI, because CRI was a Protestant. It was about giving biblical answers to questions. It was about the Bible being the final court of arbitration. And now Hank is dependent upon traditions, some of which developed in the Middle Ages, and he obviously disagrees with the Roman Catholic Church on some issues. But I don't know if some of it had to do with his health, but he wrote a book because he had some declining health. I think he got, I can't remember what illness he got. It may have been cancer, but I could be wrong on that. Last I heard is that he was getting better, and praise God. I don't wish him ill will. I hope that God heals him, and God bless him in every way. But Hank Hanegraaff, I guess at some point, he became more inclined to try to answer questions in that way, and not on the Bible as the final court of arbitration way. And that once he got christened, the criticism came, and a lot of supporters of CRI, I think, left. And so that has been a bad thing for him. But I mean, he is following his convictions, I believe. And I respect his right to do that, even though I disagree with theology. But I don't believe it's appropriate. This is my personal opinion. I think you will agree with me. You can tell me if you don't. I don't think it is appropriate for the host of the Bible Answer Man which is supposed to be the mouthpiece of a Protestant ministry that holds to the Bible as the supreme authority over any pope, any council, any tradition of men, which was what Walter Martin taught, should be the host of the Bible Answer Man or the president of CRI. That's my view. No disrespect to him personally. CRI may have been very ecumenical as a ministry, including Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholics and Coptics as brothers in Christ, but it was a Protestant ministry.
Right. So it kind of becomes a bully pulpit at that point where you can just say his new view. I was going to mention this so you can react to it also. I understand that Eastern Orthodoxy, baptism is a requirement for salvation. So, and a lot of people find that a point to be divided over, basically, because it seems to make something of works part of your requirements for salvation. So it almost nearly touches upon the gospel, depending on how you see it. I know their church, Eastern Orthodoxy, makes it clear that a person cannot earn their salvation by works. So they don't probably see it, baptism, as work. It's just they probably see it, and I can't speak for them, as a providence or something your family does. So you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to baptismal regeneration is something that has a very ancient tradition. Like the church fathers, Augustine, Jerome, Athanasius, these guys do believe in baptismal regeneration, and I find it to be a very serious error. But then they have to come up with explanations for people that don't get a chance to get baptized. I don't believe in it because baptism is a work. It's something that you have to do. Someone has to perform it. And I believe that baptism is necessary in our sanctification, in our walk as Christians, but it is not something that you do in order to become born again. It symbolizes being born again, and that's why when you look at John chapter 3, which is the verse that they like quoting, where it says that you must be born of water and of the Spirit in order to see the kingdom, they're arguing that water is baptism. Now, Hank himself, when he was a Protestant, used to explain that was a reference to Ezekiel, when Ezekiel talks about how he will sprinkle you with water and he will put a new spirit within you, cleansing. And that was that idea that there was an inward change that took place in the person. And of course, as Reformed people, you and I, and though we are in the minority among evangelicals, we believe that regeneration comes before faith. In other words, we become believers as a result of regeneration. We do not become believers and then become born again. And that's one of the differences that we have with our non-Reformed brothers. But when it comes to baptismal regeneration, it's a very difficult topic because you're getting into the symbol, which is baptism, and you're asking, is it ex operato? Does the sacrament of baptism transfer what it symbolizes to the recipient? And in the case of Roman Catholics, what you have is a baby who is being sprinkled with water, and Eastern Orthodoxy, who's being sprinkled with water in order to become born again or cleansed, or I don't know exactly how Eastern Orthodoxy sees this. But when you're looking at these kinds of things, and you look at like the book of Acts, it talks about Cornelius, he was filled with the Spirit, but he still hadn't been baptized. So how do you deal with that? Well, of course, Roman Catholics have this doctrine of the baptism of desire, but to me it's just kind of trying to work your way around the text, which clearly says that this person was born again prior to his baptism. And that's kind of the point. Now, I do find it to be a heresy in terms of you are really teeter-tottering on the gospel, but then again, that's what you're dealing with the multitude of the church fathers who did teach that. We don't know what Clement or Ignatius taught about that, but you have so many church fathers and then the medieval theologians, including Martin Luther, held at least at some point, there's a debate about that, but at least at some point he still believed in baptismal regeneration. So, and Lutherans to this day do believe that there is a cleansing that takes place when babies are baptized. So it's a complicated issue.
Yeah, I've heard that called blue collar rules. It's just rules that are written into the denomination. But anyway, I was listening to Hank's arguing on the James White video. It seemed to me a little deceptive because he was talking about the way he used to talk about defending the scriptures in the verse where it talks about Jesus' siblings and stuff. Because Mr. Hanegraaff is not saying the affirmative, or he's not arguing the affirmative. He's arguing the opposite and saying now I don't agree, or now I deeply regret ever saying that. Sounds like, well, it should never be, the Greek word should never be cousins, and he says this, and then now he's saying no, now I deeply regret saying that. It's hard to follow what, I know maybe he makes a positive argument somewhere where he says the affirmative and argues it. It's very, very confusing to follow, but I understand it obviously, but secondly, to me, like, it's very clear in the English, in the context anyway. I don't know how, like, other than trying to follow like a church father, I don't know why someone would get cousins or brothers in the universal sense. And by the way, in the lexicon, in the lexicons and stuff, and the concordances, the definition of brother there, it's very similar to English anyway. So you look at the English, take the context, I mean, it's clear.
Well, yeah, the argument that he made, though, is because you're talking about the word adelphos, and the word adelphos does have a usage in the Bible. If you look in the Old Testament Septuagint, there's a reference that Hank made where an Old Testament saint was called the brother of another person, and he was actually the uncle or the nephew or something like that. I don't have the material in front of me, so I'm kind of going by memory. Forgive me if I get something off, but it is true. But what you're talking about is the everyday common usage of a term, and what is the context in which that thing that is made. I mean, I believe in the Bible it even calls Elizabeth Mary's cousin. Now, Luke could have easily said that was her sister, right?
I guess so.
Right? So we know, because of Mary's relationship to Elizabeth, who was the mother of John the Baptist, that since they were cousins, that means that Jesus and John were cousins, right?
Right.
So we know that, okay?
Right.
But when you're talking about the everyday usage, we are looking at these verses that say Joseph married Mary, okay? There's nothing holy about the physical intimacy between a man and his wife. There's nothing unholy about that, okay? So you would naturally say, okay, well, Joseph just married Mary. What do you assume is going to happen? Now, if you're going to say, okay, well, this man and this woman who got together in marriage are not actually going to consummate, the burden of proof is on you, because the normal everyday thing is that they're going to, be together, intimate. Now, you also have references to Mary and her children walking with her. In this section where the passage says that they thought that Jesus had lost his mind, and it mentions Mary and the children. Again, natural reading of the text. Now, is it possible, hypothetically, that that the children or the brothers of Jesus or whatever are actually just relatives or kinsmen or children of Joseph from a previous marriage? It is theoretically possible, but again, is that the normal everyday way of expressing that? And if, as I said earlier, if Mary's perpetual virginity was a part of the gospel that I wanted to make sure would not get lost to the reader, that people would know. By the way, remember that Mary was always a virgin. She gave birth to no children. As you go, so I would make it very clear to make sure that people knew that those were not her children biologically, and that those are just her stepchildren or something like that. I mean, you have examples. There's a passage in Luke where someone says to Jesus, "Blessed is the womb who bore you, and the breasts that nursed you." And Jesus says, rather, blessed is he who heeds my word and does it. I can't remember the exact words. And so Roman Catholics will look at that and say, well, see, no, he says, no, but it doesn't say, don't say something positive about Mary. It just says that it's more important to believe in Jesus. But here's a perfect example. If Jesus thought that Mary's, all of the doctrines that we have of Mary were crucial, this would have been a perfect opportunity for Jesus to kind of underline that. Yes, blessed my mother, because my mother is blessed among women, which Luke says, and she is perpetual virgin, and all these different things that either Rome or Eastern Orthodoxy says. I mean, including things like the bodily assumption of Mary. I think Eastern Orthodoxy might teach that. I don't know. And
Yeah.
that's one of those things where
Yes.
even if you believe it, I mentioned to you earlier, I think it was yesterday, that even Martin Luther, John Calvin, and Francis Turretin, all of them believed in the perpetual virginity of Mary. They
Okay.
did believe this. I
Okay.
disagree
Okay.
with them, and that's okay. It's like if I believed in the perpetual virginity of Mary, you would obviously disagree with me. But it's one thing to believe in it, and it's another thing to say it's a part of the gospel that you're going to put the anathema on, and that's one problem that compounds the other problem.
Right. Um, let's talk about Matthew 125 quick. You were just touching upon the Greek words earlier as being a phrase. Um, it says here, this is the part where it says Joseph, and I quote, but kept her a virgin until she gave birth to a son, and he named him Jesus. And so I've studied logic for the LSAT test, which is the test, the pre-test, or the test before you go into law school to become an attorney. And people who study that, they're taught to not make unwarranted assumptions. So when it says, when you're looking at a passage like that, until she gave birth to a son, you're not going to make any assumptions as to what happens at the time she gives the birth to a son or after that. All we know is up to that point, he kept her a virgin. And so I suppose that this could be settled by the Greek language, but it's being a little bit persnickety and weird to apply that kind of logic when clearly, like, the scriptures say he has siblings, and the Greek, like Mr. James White seems to explain, the Greek says that means like up to that point and to that point only, or whatever.
Tell
So
us who.
yeah, do you want to just say that again as to what
Yeah, well,
how that
there's a
applies?
couple of things, and this reminds me of a discussion because both James White and Eric Svensson individually debated against Jerry Matitix on the subject of the perpetual virginity of Mary. And Jerry Matitix is actually a former Presbyterian pastor. He went to Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, graduated, very super intelligent guy, and he is now a Roman Catholic. Although he's kind of on the fringe, he's not like in the mainstream with like the Catholic Answers guys and stuff like that. But Jerry Matitix was making this argument against them regarding Matthew 125. And so James White and Eric Svensson decided to do a show on the dividing line where they were going to talk about Jerry Matitix and the stuff he was saying. And Jerry decided, well, you know what, if you guys are going to be talking about me, why don't you have me on the show, and then the three of us will have a discussion. So they did. And so I listened to that, and one of the things that happened is because in Matthew chapter 1, it mentions the phrases before they came together. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
And the Greek word that is used there is the word sunerkomai. Okay? And the
Mm-hmm.
word sunerkomai can be used in various contexts. It can
Okay.
refer to coming together in church. The word sunerkomai is used in 1 Corinthians 11 about 3 or 4 times. I think it's 4 times. And it says come together in church, right? Well, when you come together in marriage, okay, and you can look at this up, and it's funny because they commented on Bauer, Donker, Arndt, and Gingrich, which is considered like one of the preeminent or the preeminent lexicon of the Greek New Testament. It's up there with like Liddell and Scott. It's like top of the line. And they comment on this verse and they say that come together in sexual relations. It literally says that that's one of the meanings of the word. And it references Matthew 1 on this issue. It actually points to that verse as an example of this. Well, Jerry Matitix decided to go to a parenthetical statement found in that sentence where it says or in marriage contracts and stuff like that. So they could have been coming together in marriage, but not in sexual intimacy. And it's funny how a tradition that you have will literally make you find a parenthetical statement to try and escape the natural meaning of the verse of the text that you're looking at, and the definition that is provided, because Bauer, Dunkerong, and Gingrich actually say come together in sexual relations, and they point to Matthew 1 as an example of that meaning of the word sunerkomai, and he tried to get away with it by pointing to the parenthetical statement, marriage contracts, et cetera, et cetera. That's number one. Number two is that as we were talking about earlier, the word heos, which means until, the word can be the Greek is a far more explicit, more detailed language than English. Okay, and so it has, like, you can say like one sentence, like, you know, David likes Susie or something like that, right? I'm just throwing random names. And in the Greek, there will be like, I don't know, 3, 4, 5, 6 different ways of saying that one sentence, right? And so you have certain words that have different constructions, and they'll change the word order, or they might put a word and then put another word together and it becomes a phrase. And then when it becomes part of a phrase, it has a more restricted meaning. Okay. And what Svensson did in his research is that he pointed out that the construction heos hu at the time of the writing of Matthew's gospel in the first century, that word meant that there was a continued action, but not after. And he uses examples in the New Testament and stuff like that. And he had gone through I forget what it's called. It's this research where you look at all of the Greek literature of that time within a specific time frame. And so when you're looking at that, I mean, it's the usage of a specific phrase, and the phrase heos hu in the New Testament always means until but not after. But for the people that advocate the perpetual virginity of Mary, they have to say, well, this is the exception, or because this phrase may have been used differently 100 years before or 100 years after, we have to ignore the common usage in that particular point in time. No, of course, we have to understand that language changes over time. That's why you can use expressions like "King of Pop" would be a reference to Michael Jackson, but that would not have been known in 1950, right? But it's known today because that's his legacy. If you were to talk about the Godfather of Soul, no one in the 1920s would have known what you were talking about, because it's James Brown. So you have words and phrases that have a very specific meaning, and so in Matthew 1:25, it uses heos hu, which according to the research means until but not after.
That's very excellent. Thanks for sharing. Yeah, good explanation. We should probably keep wrapping up here very soon. I would just repeat my initial remarks that these doctrines would seem to exalt females in society and open the door to skew the gender roles a little bit strangely, where people could become a goddess per se, females becoming goddesses. No, I think we cover a lot of territory here. Do you want to make any final remarks before we close up?
Yeah. Well, just to piggyback on what you just said, I mean, Walter Martin had he had like the 7 steps to I think it was like making Mary into a goddess. Now, bear in mind, Roman Catholics say, no, we are not saying that Mary's a goddess. We're not saying that. So I understand that they are not saying that, okay? But when you look at the parallels that have been made, Jesus was his birth was immaculate. He was without sin. Mary is born immaculate without sin. Now, according to these dogmas, Jesus never got married and never had any children. Mary never had any children according to their doctrine, and was never. There was no. In fact, in Roman Catholicism, there's one more thing I wanted to add. In Roman Catholicism, they believe that not only was Mary a virgin when she gave birth to Jesus, but they believe that her virginity was intact after Jesus came out. And I'm not trying to get too, graphic here, but they're basically saying that when after Jesus was born, if you were to hypothetically examine her, like a gynecologist were to examine her, she'd still have everything intact. So This is the miracle of what they call what is called the virgin birth. But now for a Protestant, we don't have a problem with saying that uh, her virginity was not intact after the birth of Jesus. And so that just is a side point I wanted to make. But then when you're looking at things like, well, Jesus ascended to the right hand of the Father. Well, Mary was supposedly bodily assumed into heaven. And Jesus is the mediator between God and man. Well, guess what? Mary is considered a co-mediatrix by many Roman Catholic scholars. I mean, this has never been dogmatically defined by a pope or a council that Mary is co-mediatrix, but the doctrine is believed. And then you have her being called found, and of course, I know we're going off on Roman Catholicism. Eastern Orthodoxy has these similarities, but when you're looking at these doctrines of Mary, you have her being called fountain of salvation, spouse of the Spirit, uh, the Ark of the New Covenant, Queen of Heaven. They even have prayers where it even says that Mary can actually, if Jesus is angry and having wrath, Mary can pray to him and calm him down, according to Roman Catholicism. And so
Okay.
she may not be a goddess in Roman Catholicism, but she's very powerful in Roman Catholicism, and she all but that.
Interesting. That's really, really interesting. Well, thanks for coming on. And I'm just going to close up then.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
Yeah. Have a good rest of your day.
May I plug my church really quick?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm Johnny. I attend Acts Reformed Church in Covina, California. You can find us at actsreformedchurch.org. Our social media, Instagram, Twitter, and Parler. We are at Acts 1689, at ACTS 1689. Thank you, and God bless.
Thanks. God bless, sir.